Plumbing. What is there to say about plumbing? I don't have most of the drain installation footage, so this is going to be going a little bit differently. I'll cover some useful tips, how I go about filtering trades, and two of the main plumbing features that I added to my house that you don't usually see. One thing I'll say is, inspectors like to see that you made an effort, that things are straight and in even lines and even spacing. So I made a jig that gives me proper spacing away from the edge of a floor joist according to local structural building code. I also made it wide enough that I could mark out a pair of holes that maintain proper distance as well. All of the specs for this were determined by structural building code and not by plumbing, so if you want to make one, it's going to depend on what sort of material you have, dimensional lumber versus manufactured I-joists, and what code says about where you can drill and how big the holes you can drill are allowed to be. Then I added to this jig so that I could run 4 lines of PEX in the same area while maintaining proper spacing. To use the jig, I set up my laser wherever I want to be running my lines, and then I can just trace around the outside of the corners on both sides at the top. Wherever the Sharpie makes a corner, that's where I drill. In this, I'm using a 1-inch DeWalt spade bit because I couldn't find my 1-inch Bosch Daredevil. Way easier with the Daredevil, but I try to limit how much time that I'm willing to waste running around looking for stuff. The other thing I'll say is the rules around plumbing code seem to be a lot more, these are the rules instead of this makes sense, and they're a lot more difficult to find. Unlike electrical, I couldn't find anything like the PS Knight simplified codebook. There are rules around lengths of drains, sizes of drains, distance between cleanouts, degrees of bend allowed between cleanouts, and the list goes on. When I wanted to move my water meter, it took 2 different supervisors at the city to find out what rules were or were not involved in that. And I still haven't been able to find anyone who can explain wet venting in any sort of intelligent way. If you have a resource on that, please let me know. One thing I don't mind doing is bringing people in to quote for a job, and if they're at all reasonable, have them do the work. Unfortunately, in this town, people aren't very reasonable. However, in this case, it proved useful to have one plumber look over work another plumber had done because he found a fitting that another plumber had used for my natural gas line going to my furnace that is never, ever allowed. In my city, you can do something that's called a code inquiry, which means I can call the city, talk to one of their inspectors, explain what I'm trying to do, and ask my question. They'll answer as best they can, mistakes happen, but it's always better than just guessing. Usually they'll ask a few questions to clarify and make sure they understand what I'm talking about. When I heard the plumber in this video say that this one fitting, called a Street 90, wasn't allowed, I figured, hey, let's call and double check with the city. When I asked the plumbing inspector, is a Street 90 allowed for gas lines? Instead of asking any questions, getting any clarification, or any muck around at all, he answered, no. I say, never? He says, never. So this other licensed, ticketed, trained previous plumber who had installed it knew, I actually called him later to get him to fix it, and he still refused to fix it. Anyway, back to this new guy. I'm a big believer in being able to communicate with anyone you're hiring and making sure they can communicate on whatever level I'm at. They might be able to talk tech all day with another plumber, but if they can't explain it like I'm 5, as a first call out, they're in the sales position kind of guy, then I won't work with them. A lot of the time I'll even pretend that I know less than I do just to make sure they're on legit level. This guy communicated pretty well, and I did end up hiring him to rerun my gas line and give me a rough-in for the tankless that I wanted. Unfortunately, the guy he sent out to do the work broke my regulator, and I had to call the utility company to come fix it. That was a whole other adventure for sure. I called in, explained that I could smell gas outside. They said, okay, we'll send someone out to fix it. I asked them, is this like when you call the cable company, they'll send someone out in a 4-hour window? And they replied, no, we consider this an emergency. Someone will be there in about 15 minutes. That blew my freaking mind. And the utility guy actually got there that fast. On top of the broken regulator, some of the lines his guys installed were so loose that I could move them with just one finger. At that point, having gone through 3 different gas fitters, I decided to just bum some pipe wrenches and fix it myself. A word about wet walls. A wet wall is a wall that you can run plumbing in. You can frame them in 2x4. I did it here and it did all work out. I would suggest, if you ever need to do this much rough-in work, that you frame it in 2x6 instead. Stuff gets really tight really quickly in 2x4 walls. Clamps versus crimps for PEX. I like clamps. The tool is cheaper and it fits in tighter areas easier. Pex A versus Pex B. Pex B clamps are like 6 cents each and Pex A sleeves are 33 cents each. at least where I'm allowed to shop. A lot of supply houses here won't sell non-pros, and if they do, they'll charge more than retail anyway. It's faster to clamp a ring on instead of expand a sleeve as well. I like flat walls. I'm the cabinet guy here too, and I don't want to be fussing around with 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch bulge because I didn't bother to notch out for my plumbing strapping. Another way to do this would have been to add framing in behind and just nail a pipe support on, but as I mentioned before, 2x4 walls get really, really tight. On a side note, I'd use a router in the future, I just didn't have one when I did this work. Manifold Plumbing. Doesn't cost much more in materials, definitely costs more in time. Gives me the option to isolate any individual faucet and minimizes thermal shock when someone flushes a toilet. Plus, it impresses people, which is good for selling. I knew I was going to be plumbing on an exterior wall, which generally speaking isn't the best idea in the world, freezing and whatnot. So I furred out the wall by an extra 1/2 inch, which would let me run the pipes on the warm side of the insulation rather than bury them inside the insulation. Again, next time, 2x6 wet walls. Remember those code inquiries I mentioned before? Someone gave me a wrong answer, and that could have been because I asked the wrong question, or we just two ships in the night sort of thing. In this case, I had run a 2-inch pipe as my main stack vent, and code required a 3-inch pipe, so I got to redo it. It does bring up another point though. Plumbers, electricians, etc. all need to have some idea of what the other trades do and how they do. For me, I've already installed the roof, see the previous video series, so popping off the old boot and replacing a new one wasn't a big deal. Just ended up being a lot of attic climbing again. There were a lot of awkward positions trying to get the old reducers cut out. It took the better part of 4 hours to replace the main stack, but then it passed inspection without any further troubles. Finally got my tankless on the wall, and somehow managed to lose the recording of that. And this is me installing the valves underneath. They took a couple of extra weeks to come in, but aside from that, this tankless install would have been a one-day job with $2,300 in materials. And people in this town won't do that job for less than $5,000. This gets back to what I was saying earlier about if people are at all reasonable, I'll hire them to do a job. But $2,500 to $2,700 in just labor for one day's work, that doesn't sound very reasonable to me. A little bit of black iron work, which I couldn't finish this time due to a slight mismeasurement and lack of pipe nipples. Then a little bit of PVC drain work, and the water heater is just about ready to go. I will say though that this is how plumbing kinda always goes. You can plan and try and overbuy and make as much effort as you can to make sure that you get all the materials you need and all the parts and all the pieces and all the glues and everything. But when it comes to plumbing, somehow you're always just going to be missing something every single time. Even the guys I hired on the 3rd time to do the gas fitting had to go back out to the store to get some extra pieces. Like, this is just how plumbing goes. This was later that same day. Finally got the right fitting, pre-filled the condensate, got it all up and finished and tested. This was a big one for me because of how much gatekeeping goes on around these things here. You can hear how happy I was to get it done. It works. I installed a tankless hot water heater. I actually did it. Not just like, I got it part of the way and then called it, but like I actually did it. I am loving it. Ba 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 ba. The last thing the water heater wanted was a cold line filter, which took even more time to arrive, but here it is. Pretty simple install, a quick air purge, and it's good to go. Finally, if you're going to install manifold plumbing, make sure you label it all. That's kind of all I've got for this video, so go get back to work.